Today, we're going to be interacting with a video that took place on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he's interviewing Abigail Shrier talking about her book, Bad Therapy, which is actually one of the books that I recently recommended on a past podcast episode. And so let's take a look at their conversation.
There's a fine line. Where is the point of diminishing returns? Where is it valuable to address feelings and anxiety and thoughts? And is it irresponsible to do so without giving them tools to mitigate those things? And along with those tools, to explain to them that there's things that they're going to have to do in this life that are very difficult, right, but that there's a great reward in doing these very difficult things.
And so just the premise in starting off is this question, and it sort of, it relates to therapy in general, but it also relates just more broadly to how we approach difficulties, and that especially for the younger generation now, we seem to be communicating to the message things should not be difficult. If you're experiencing difficulty, if you're experiencing anxiety, that is like a problem to be fixed, that something is wrong, you should not be experiencing that. And so Joe is just kind of starting off the whole idea of saying, you don't want to just ignore people who are feeling overwhelmed, but at the same time, there can be this sense of coddling that could be counterproductive. And so that leads into the discussion that follows.
So the problem, as I see it, is not that you're not saying suck it up. It's that no one ever says suck it up, no matter how minor the scratch to these kids, okay? And sometimes being told you'll live. Remember when Dad used to say you'll live or, shake it off? We never hear shake it off anymore. No one says it.
So just as a quick note, this was less from my childhood, but I have this memory. She talked about the whole idea of what a dad might say when I was like 20 or 21 and had just had a breakup and was pretty devastated by the breakup. I'm not devastated by it anymore. It led to me meeting my wife and things went great. But I was pretty devastated at the time, and I remember going to my dad and kind of expecting this yeah, I can't believe this happened to you. Oh my gosh, you thought you were going to marry, all these different things. And it's not that he was utterly unsympathetic, but he was not devastated about the breakup. And he was saying things to me like, yeah, I know that this is hard, but God uses these things, and that this relationship was not wasted. You handled yourself in a healthy way, and God will use that. And I was so frustrated over the idea that I felt like he didn't see it as this world-ending thing that I saw it as. And while he didn't say the words like "you'll live" or "suck it up" or "shake it off," that was kind of the attitude that I got from him. And at the time, it really annoyed me. But later on, as I reflected on it, I felt like it was very positive, because I was in this sense of just saying nobody has ever recovered from something like this happening. And my dad was able to reflect no, people have, and you will too. And so that kind of perspective does help. It can be tricky because you want to acknowledge how somebody's feeling. And especially with a kid, they can be frustrated if they're saying you're not even acknowledging that this is hard. You can acknowledge that something's hard, but also say you can handle this. This isn't the end of all things. This isn't too hard to handle. I often say to my kids, difficult is not the same as impossible. And so I think that she's bringing up a very valid point that can be done badly, but also can be done very well.
So they don't know they can overcome even minor injuries. And the truth is they can. They can. But they recently did these studies on these, coping techniques. They taught coping techniques to teenagers, over 1,000 teenagers in Australia. It was called the Wise Teens Program. They talked to, that was the point. It was just to help them with emotional regulation. And it turned out it made kids sadder and more anxious. They measured this. And the reason was regularly ruminating on your bad feelings can make you feel worse.
Did you talk to therapists when you did this?
Yeah, a lot of therapists.
Yeah. How many of them agree with you?
So before going on to this next part, I think Abigail Shrier, I'm fairly certain, I don't think that she's a believer. I don't know how religious she is. In fact, I think that she's Jewish. But the point that she brings up there is a point that I think is really reflected in a Christian worldview. And it is the whole idea of if we believe I am going to sort of get out of this anxiety or depression or discouragement or self-loathing that I'm feeling by sort of focusing attention on it and going deeper into how I'm feeling about this, often, in fact, I'd say many more times than not, that is not the case. And what we get in Scripture is this whole idea. In fact, Tim Keller, one of my favorite Christian leaders over the past number of years, who recently went home to be with the Lord, has this little booklet. It's basically a sermon that was turned into a little booklet, and it's called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And I frequently think about that in this context, and just the whole idea of there's this great joy and this great peace that comes from not viewing yourself as being the one at the center of the story. Jesus is at the center of the story. This is God's story that he's telling. We are characters into it. We are benevolently welcomed into this story as characters who are beloved by God. But when I fix my eyes on Jesus, when I'm focused on him, when I, in the words of Jesus, when I find that my food is to do the work of my Father, and when I'm focused on that, it's going to be much easier for me to see my problems in perspective, rather than if I'm just zeroing in on them. It's not hard to understand this. If you're like, all right, I'm feeling discouraged because of this breakup, or because of this job loss, or because of this I don't have the job that I want, something like that. And then you end up just saying, now I'm just going to stare at it and focus on it. I'm going to solve it just by focusing more and more attention on it. Sometimes you'd say you might do better just by saying all right, the job is kind of a bummer right now, but let's see, what has God called you to? What do you have in your life? Man, you've got a great family. You've got a great church. Most of all, you have a God who has forgiven all of your sins and loves you. When you get your eyes off it, sometimes that can bring much more help, even if the situation itself doesn't change.
So there was a huge split. The academic research psychologists overwhelmingly agreed. They were aware of the literature, and they said, yeah, these are bad practices. Here are things we shouldn't be doing with kids. What was interesting is a lot of the clinical therapists were either minimized the risks of therapy or denied that there were any.
But isn't that like Jiffy Lube? Like when you tell them, you don't need to change your oil that much. Well, it's their business to change oil.
Right. Exactly. So I talked to this one amazing, child psychologist who said to me, I start by having my patients sign a waiver in which they acknowledge that there can be risks. And the reason I do that is because I don't want them to experience harm.
And just real quick on this, she talks about this a lot in her book, which I do recommend. And I'm not anti-counseling. She also is not anti-counseling. But she talks about the idea that sometimes we view therapy and counseling and all of this as if there's no potential downside to it. And a big part of what she just advocates in the book is we're seeing, at least in certain practices, that there are potential downsides, and we should be weighing that, especially when we're thinking about kids. A lot of her book is about kids. Now, some of the things are more broadly applicable to any of us who might go to therapy or might go to counseling, but especially when it comes to kids, that we need to see that there's a risk. There's a potential reward, but there's also a potential risk going into this.
So if they see that their worries are getting worse, they have to tell me.
But do they? Would they? I mean, it seems like the therapist is the one who's in control, right?
Right.
The therapist is the expert. They're the one who has the authority.
Right. Well, I mean, this one was Camilo Ortiz was one of the, he was the one I talked to, and he was the one that I was referring to there. And first of all, he always starts a therapy by setting the number of sessions. It's not, he doesn't treat a kid like an annuity. You're going to, be my income stream for years.
Right.
He attacks, and also they come to him with an actual problem, like chronic bedwetting, like, various kinds of phobia. Mm-hmm. There are people who treat anorexia. They're tackling a problem.
Right.
And some of those therapies are extremely necessary and very successful.
Yeah, and an important point that she makes right there at the end in talking about that therapist is, first of all, the idea of zeroing in on a problem that could actually be solved, and then also looking to have the mentality of saying, you're not meant to be in therapy perpetually. Now, one of the things, I think one of the reasons why sort of therapy is so widespread right now is because we are not as connected to one another as human beings. And even when we do spend time with you, I mean, there's less friendship, there's fewer people involved in churches than there were in past times, or even in other cultures where there's a lot more sort of religious involvement by the entire community. In some of these things, I say, man, if you just had a good friend, if you just had a group of friends, if you just had a small group and you could be open with this, or if you just decide to join Celebrate Recovery, where you can be open about this like major thing that you're dealing with. There's so many of these things that I'm like, yeah, we do need to talk to somebody about that. We do need to be open, and we do need to have somebody who's going to be willing to listen to us. And sometimes we end up with a problem that is sort of above, that we need somebody who's studied this and is going to come up with techniques and ways to help us, because it's a much bigger thing. But even within that, we'd want to look at it and say, all right, I've got this problem that I'm looking to resolve here. And also, I'm looking at this as a limited time that I'm giving this level of focus to it. Maybe in the same way that when that show, The Biggest Loser, was on and people would come and they'd be morbidly obese, and then they would go for this intensive where they'd lose all this weight. Where it's like, you can't live on the Biggest Loser ranch forever. You can't just live there perpetually. You can have a time where you say, I've got to such an unhealthy point that I need to just give extreme focus to this to get back to some kind of stability, and then figure out a way to go on with my everyday life. I think to some degree, therapy can be like that, where you say, all right, I've got something that's so disruptive to my life that I need to give it some focused attention and tackle this, with the hope, with the plan of then figuring out how I live my everyday life without focusing that kind of full attention on it. And so I think that this is important for all of us, but especially for those of us who have kids, because there is such a sort of cultural pull now. I mean, for a long time, it's like there was a big stigma related to counseling, and now there's a big pull to get kids into counseling. And I think that it can be good, but there should be some reluctance. There should be some thoughtfulness on this. Because first of all, we want to make sure that we get them in with somebody that's good. And also we want to make sure not to communicate to kids, if you're sometimes sad or if you're sometimes anxious, oh my gosh, we got to get you into therapy. Instead of saying, you know what, everybody's sometimes sad. Everybody's sometimes anxious. Let's talk about how we work this through, and let's talk about the gospel speaking into this, and let's talk about how you live in the reality that sometimes you're going to be sad, and sometimes you're going to be overwhelmed, and sometimes you're going to be anxious, instead of seeing that as something where you got to take a pill or go see somebody, and that feeling should never be present. You can live with this discomfort, and you don't need to see it as a sort of a dysfunction that needs to be immediately zapped and taken away.